Hi, I'm Rachel Sutherland, Flavour and Sensory Development Specialist working in partnership between the University of Nottingham and Warner's Distillery. The aim of my research is to develop a deeper understanding of the interactions between botanical ingredients both in the distillation and post-distillation processes, with the hopes to improve quality, drive new product development and promote consumer engagement. So at Warner's, we are extremely passionate about using our farm-grown ingredients, not only from a sustainability and experiential point of view, but also for the flavour and quality benefits that this brings. We believe that real tastes better, and speaking from experience, I can assure you that real isn't always the easier path to go through, but we know it's worth it when it comes to our products. We want to prove that what we claim is true, and we want to legitimise the work that we're doing. So today I'll be sharing a bit about our ongoing research into fresh, farm-grown botanicals and their use in our spirits. So on our farm, we currently have 3 botanical gardens, each packed full of a range of different botanicals. We constantly rotate our botanicals and innovate with new ingredients to aid in our ongoing product development. This is a huge amount of work for both our horticultural and product development teams, and there's a vast amount of testing to be done when it comes to fully understanding a farm-grown botanical. All plants show changes in their chemical makeup throughout their maturity. This can be influenced by a great deal of variables, including weather, geographical location, and plant age, to name but a few. This means that for us to optimise these natural ingredients to best suit our needs, we need to understand how to get both the best yield and the best flavour profile, depending on how the botanical will be used. So, for example, a botanical might show better flavour profiles for distillation when it's young, but might improve with age when it comes to post-distillation maceration. Another area we consider to be of vital importance in all of this is biodiversity. Our botanical gardens provide a habitat for a great deal of species, and we try to factor this in as much as possible when it comes to planning and harvesting our botanicals, so that we can work alongside nature in the least disruptive way possible and hopefully reap the benefits of that. So we've been using farm-grown botanicals in our products for quite a few years now, including our lemon balm gin, our non-alcoholic range, and most recently our spice botanical rum, a few of which you might see behind me here. However, each of these has presented its own challenges when it comes to harvesting and using farm-grown ingredients. Recipes quite often may need to be tweaked depending on the quality of our harvests. Sometimes, both in yield and flavour, the botanicals can exceed our expectations, which is great, whereas other times they can leave us slightly disappointed. It makes for an exciting challenge to constantly be aware that your ingredients might not be what you were expecting, and that's where this work that we're doing here is so crucial for us. When it comes to understanding a farm-grown botanical, typically we start by distilling the harvested botanical individually and comparing it against something else, for example, supplier bought version. This is then presented to our trained sensory panel, who are based here at the distillery, to identify any differences. If the botanical is deemed worthy, it's then brought into the next stage where we might incorporate into an existing or the current recipe that we're working on to see how it performs. Again, if it does well, it then moves further into our product development process and might become part of a new product. So, not just being satisfied with doing one at a time, back in 2019, we challenged ourselves with creating a true to type London dry gin using only botanicals that could be sourced from within 3 miles of the distillery, otherwise known as a bee's flight. It was a bit ambitious and crazy of us, but we decided to give it a try and it worked. So I'm going to talk you through that process now and sort of where we got to and how we decided to tackle that. So all the botanicals were harvested locally and some were processed to optimise flavours, which I'll get onto in a little bit. I should mention that for the recipe, all the botanicals were harvested here on the farm, apart from juniper. Despite having a juniper bush and incorporating this juniper into our product, for the volumes we needed, we could not hit the amount of juniper, so we did need to put in some supplier bought juniper. So yeah, in terms of foraging, our distillers were put to work foraging the botanicals, which was both good fun and a bit of a challenge, but I know that we all enjoyed it. So I think we should start with what is a true type London dry gin. So the gin that we made, it was a limited edition back in 2019 called Farmed and Foraged. So we compared our Farmed and Foraged gin against 8 popular commercial London dry gins on the market, and we ran this through GCMS, so gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis, through the University of Nottingham. So for this analysis, a method was devised for optimum extraction of the volatile compounds in all of the gins. In order to confidently identify the volatile components, they were identified and quantified by comparison of mass spectra with those of known reference compounds and also a mass spectra library. So hopefully you can see from the radar plot that should be on the screen now, just a small glimpse into some of the results that we saw from this analytical work. I should note that this study and the ones that we're going to talk about were all performed in triplicate for high analytical reliability. So each GC spectrum that we saw coming out, both from our gins and the comparator gins, showed approximately 40 to 60 peaks, each of which corresponded to a different molecule and quite often a flavour compound that was important for final gin. We chose these compounds on the graph here as key gin marker compounds, as they were present in each of the gins and are recognised in other related literature. So as you can see, our spirit made from only farm-grown botanicals shows a very similar flavour profile to an average of the 8 competitor gins made more conventionally. It does, however, show an overall greater concentration of many of these key gin compounds, indicating perhaps that the use of these farm-grown botanicals might enhance the formation of these desirable flavour compounds. This effect is particularly observed in the beta-myrcene, alpha-pinene and terpenine compounds that we saw. So looking at this, we were happy to say that we had managed to create a true to type gin analytically, but we want to know how the product scored sensory-wise. So to do this, we then took it a step further, stuck with GC, but we used GCO, known as GC olfactometry, which involves a GCMS with a nosing port attached to it, so you can smell each individual flavour compound as it comes off. So to do this, we ran both our farmed and foraged gin, again in triplicate, and our Harrington dry gin through the machine. So our Harrington dry gin was already considered to be a true to type London dry gin due to its use of typical dry botanicals at the time. The Harrington dry is a conventional gin, but used the same process as the farmed and foraged gin. So this comparison minimised any potential process variables that might have come in if we had used, say, a gin made by a different company. So in the GCO analysis, again, we got GCMS spectrum peaks coming out, but also we incorporated sensory into this. So the Warner's trained sensory panel, which consisted of 8 panellists, were asked to describe all the odours as they came off and asked to rank them in terms of intensity as well. So as you can see from this radar plot here, the results show that once again, the use of the farm-grown botanicals has increased the odour intensity of certain marker compounds, in this case mainly beta-pinene, limonene and eucalyptyl. But again, we see very similar output, so we're getting all of those true to type London dry elements coming through just in slightly different concentrations. So after understanding the final farm and forage spirit, we decided to take a step back and look at our individual botanicals in a bit more depth. Foraging locally can be difficult for a number of reasons, but especially when it comes to replicating flavours that you would typically get globally. We often find that the fresh botanicals we harvested just didn't give us the flavours we needed to create our typical true to type London dry gin. Replicating, for example, spices like coriander or cinnamon proved difficult with just fresh botanicals. So we decided to investigate further processing methods. So not only did we use the fresh botanicals in some instances, and we'll get into that a little bit later on, but we looked into other processing methods as well. So, for example, we air dried some botanicals, we oven roasted some, and we charred some as well, as a way of optimising flavour chemicals. We're obviously very lucky in the fact that we have our botanicals yards from our stills throughout our 3 botanical gardens, meaning that using botanicals fresh is not as huge a challenge for us as it might be for some other distilleries out there, in which case it might be impossible for some. Fresh botanicals, they're just, they're difficult to work with unless you have the capability. So they can spoil very quickly. And so to preserve them, we found that drying, obviously, is often the way to go. This can also allow for increases in consistency and can allow for longer storage periods. So if you needed to make this product, not just seasonally, but throughout the year as well, drying is the way to go. Most botanicals, obviously, will undergo changes to their volatile composition after drying. Drying can alter volatiles differently, with drastic increases in some compounds and reductions in others, and almost no change in some of the other ones. This can be managed by choosing certain methods of drying. For example, we chose air drying because it was easy and we could do it quite simply, and it gave us what we needed as well. But oven drying and freeze drying also are viable options when it comes to botanicals. Time of drying as well plays an important role, with many literature stating that decreasing drying time can actually help to increase the retention of your essential oils. So what we did is we processed these botanicals, and each botanical had its own processing methods. The samples of the botanicals, both pre and post-processing, were individually distilled in triplicate at lab scale, and the distillates were analysed through GCMS again, so that the compounds created through these processing steps could be identified. The following graph shows a few of the botanicals that I've chosen to focus on for today's talk. So once again, we managed to collect a huge amount of data by looking at all these botanicals, both pre and post processing. Today we've decided just to show a small summary of some of the key botanicals that we want to focus on. And I've summarised these botanicals into 3 chemical groups: monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, and then another category. So the majority of the volatiles fell into the first 2 categories, with the other category containing compounds like certain esters and alcohols. So looking at the graph, starting over with the very first one, for the likes of lemon verbena and lemon thyme, we saw quite similar outcomes actually. Upon drying, so processing in this case was drying, we saw a significant reduction in many important volatiles. Lemon verbena, for example, showed the greatest overall decrease in monoterpenes at 54% and a 70% decrease in sesquiterpenes after the drying process, indicating that perhaps the most desirable flavour compounds might have been lost when it was not distilled fresh. Lemon thyme also showed a similar pattern after drying, with monoterpenes decreasing about 27% in all, and the sesquiterpenes showed just 5% decreases. However, if we were to delve into that data a little bit more and look at individual flavour compounds that can be quite important to the final product, we saw things like limonene and saponine showed large increases upon drying. And this is, we had to interpret all of these things when thinking about what could be causing flavour changes after processing. So we decided that this actually matched up quite well with what our sensory panel had said. So for these reasons, we chose to use these botanicals fresh. We felt like the flavour profile they gave fresh was more what we wanted in the product and complemented the other botanicals in a much better way than if we were to use them dry. So moving on, lavender is another one that we incorporated into Farm and Foraged. If you look at the graph here, you'll see that actually lavender showed overall very little change after drying. The most dramatic change has actually been increases to certain ester compounds, so falling into the other category here. This again matched up with the flavour of the botanical distillate found by the sensory panel. They fed back that by using dried, we actually got more desirable fruity flavours coming through in the distillate. For this reason, and also the logistical reasons in drying, obviously as mentioned, even though we are incredibly lucky, using fresh botanicals is still a slight challenge. And so because we saw increases in desirable flavour compounds, and again, for these logistical reasons, we decided that dried lavender was the way to go for this flavour profile. Lemon verbena and lemon thyme were easily harvested fresh prior to distillation, whereas on a larger scale, lavender would actually have required more time and labour for us here at the distillery, because rather than picking the lavender and putting it straight in the still, we actually have found that lavender heads perform better when they're not on their stalks, so we would need an extra step to remove them from their stalks there, and it would have just been a bit crazy and a bit mean to our poor distillers to have to do that. So moving on to juniper, this was a really interesting botanical and we were quite excited by these results when we saw them. I should mention that, as I said before, we couldn't use just juniper from the farm in the final gin because the volume that we need we could never harvest for what we had. But for these trials here, everything used was purely farm-grown juniper, so it's a good like-for-like comparison. So by comparing the fresh juniper from the farm against the dried, we see huge changes, as you can see. Sesquiterpene compound showed a 531% increase after drying. Despite this, we actually used fresh juniper, so even though there was a lot more compounds apparently after drying, we actually went for the fresh juniper because less for the range of volatiles, but more for the higher relative composition of monoterpenes we saw. These included things like terpenine, theugene, saponine, if we wanted to dive in a little bit deep, all of which are known in literature to be woody, oily, piney and citrus related in flavour. And this is actually what our sensory panel reported as well. So by using the fresh juniper from the farm, we got yeah, just really nice juniper flavours coming through that were a bit more citrusy, a bit more piney, and we felt would work really nicely in the product to give it a little extra special twist, whilst maintaining that true to type London dry character. So that's why we did that. But it was a really interesting botanical to work with, and despite the limited edition gin now being sold out, it still remains one of my favourite, and I do believe it's from that green juniper. It was just really, really nice. So the final botanical I wanted to focus on was the dandelion root. This was quite a unique botanical to us at the time, and we've actually taken this. So from this project, we loved what dandelion root brought into the gin, and we've brought that forward and used it in our spice botanical RAM as one of the main flavour compounds. We've gone through a slightly different processing method since then, and again, this is it's a constant learning piece. So by understanding the core botanicals, you can then take them further by going through all these different processing methods. And each time you do something different, you will get slightly different flavours. So it's a real challenge and reward scheme, to be honest, playing about with them like this. So looking at the graph, the dandelion root shows decreases in monoterpenes by 38%, and sesquiterpenes were down by 74% after roasting. So this wasn't just dried, we actually oven roasted the dandelion root. By roasting the dandelion root, it allowed for less, and this is what the sensory panel fed back, it allowed for less green and rooty notes, whilst introducing richer chocolatey flavours, which we found to be beautiful. And again, it just brought a bit of that earthiness and spiciness that we were struggling to get into the gin. So if we wanted to delve into this a little bit deeper, an 83% increase in 2-pentylfuran was seen after oven roasting, and literature states that this is actually quite caramel-like and cooked, so we believe that this is where the chocolatey notes originated from. But yeah, we were really happy with how that one turned out. Oven roasting was definitely the way to go. The root, when used fresh, was, as you would expect a root to be, quite rooty, quite raw, just very green, but it was a completely different flavour profile after processing, and exactly what the gin needed. So I would quite happily sit here all day and talk you through all of our analytical and sensory results that we got from this work. And I should mention as well that this work hasn't stopped, it's constantly going on. I'm constantly, the team here is constantly looking at our results and constantly striving to see how we can play about with the botanicals that we have to create exciting new flavours. But to wrap up a little bit, here at Warner's, we're extremely lucky to have access to some of the best ingredients nature has to offer. Despite having played about with a variety of farm-grown botanicals for years now, we are still very much at the beginning of our journey when it comes to using and optimising these ingredients. It makes for an exciting challenge and a constant source of innovation to not only use the botanicals in their natural state, but to further investigate processing and flavour extraction methods. Factoring in, I think, is an important part. The rise in conscious consumerism in recent years, there's an increased demand for greater levels of responsibility from the industry, and not only from our consumers, but from our suppliers, from each other, to improve our environmental impact. We believe that what we do here by foraging locally, that helps us to do that. And hopefully you've seen that not only from that perspective, but also from the key flavour and quality benefits that we've seen, that we can strive towards this by foraging locally for our botanicals. We hope that the work shown here shows opportunity for greater understanding of flavours generated through plant material, which can always be investigated further. There's always more to know and there's always more to learn. I've tried to keep our findings as light and brief as possible, while still being informative and hopefully interesting, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.